Hello and a very warm welcome to you. It is time once again for the annual Munich Security Conference, where 100 leading figures, bigwigs, including presidents and prime ministers, get together to look at security policy which is shaping the world in which we live. Well, this year there are some pretty major concerns about the end of a US-Russia nuclear treaty and the so-called liberal international order. Are we heading for a new world order or perhaps disorder? Good to have you with us. You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Many have urged Europe to defend and save what is broadly called the liberal international order, both from powers such as China and Russia and even the current US administration. But is it in a position to do so?
It was 1987, President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev coming together to sign a treaty completely eliminating ground-based ballistic missiles with a range of 500 to 5,000 kilometers. 32 years later, President Donald Trump is accusing Russia of violating the treaty since 2014, a charge which the Kremlin denies. Now both have pulled out of a pact regarded as one of the most important safeguards against nuclear war. Analysts say Trump's decision leaves Russia free to shape the military balance in Europe. His repeated attacks on Europe's lack of defence spending has unsettled the Union, which relies on America for security and defence. Against this backdrop, some politicians are seeking closer ties with Moscow and Beijing. Could Russia use this opportunity to divide NATO? And what does this mean for the liberal international order?
Pleased to say that joining us from Vienna, that is of course in Austria, we have the political analyst Klaus Jurgens. With me at the round table, Dr. Grant Christopher, who is Programme Director at Ridgeway and is an expert in nuclear proliferation. And Inderjeet Parmar is with us, Professor of International Politics at City University here in the UK and author of Foundations of the American Century. Thanks ever so much for coming in. Let me go to you first of all, Klaus, since you're in Vienna and it's, gosh, not that far away from Munich, so I'm suggesting that you might know more about the conference itself than those of us here in London. The world on the brink is one of the phrases that's been used in introductions to the conference. Is this INF treaty the real thing that they're talking about in Munich, or are there other more pressing concerns?
I think the Munich conference this year will be rather special. Under normal circumstances, it is a high-level gathering. You would talk about many issues, but you would not necessarily agree on a precise roadmap. Now, since the INF thing happened this year, as far as I understand from the invitations and the recent updates, it will be rather special. It will not be a criticism per se vis-à-vis Washington or Moscow. I think because it is held in Germany, in Munich, one of the overriding topics will be, is there a new Cold War literally waiting on the doorstep? And if so, how would it impact Europe? Because ultimately, Europe suffered a lot from the last Cold War. And now, since this INF thing happened, what I hear from the capitals here and from the conference, you would say, look, can we not bring those people back to like our round table here? Is it really too late? Because who is going to suffer? Who is going to suffer from the new arms race? Where will it actually take place? Where will it be felt most? Go to the Baltic states, go to Poland, go to Eastern Europe, and you will see great worries. Why did we not stop, first of all, Washington, and then, of course, Moscow, from basically shelving a 30-year-old treaty, which to most I spoke with made and makes good political sense. So I think there will be a rather urgent discussion this time.
Klaus, it is chilling what you say. So Inderjeet, follow up on what he suggested, that the question was, are we about to see a new Cold War?
Well, it certainly has that kind of chilly feel, and the propaganda or the rhetoric from particularly from Europe and also from the United States has been in that kind of direction. I think the key thing is that, if you like, you talked about the liberal international order, and if you extend it to the kind of military security and nuclear kind of regimes.
May I stop you for just a second?
Sure.
It's a phrase that's bandied around. Yeah, liberal international order. Define it for our viewers before you continue.
Well, basically it's the kind of post-1945 system of institutions and regimes set up by the United States and Britain and their allies in order to effectively replace empires and create a new set of structures for the world to get to peace and some sort of stability and order. And we know that it was largely focused around North America and Western Europe. It excluded a very large number of other powers. And in the last 30 years or so, those other powers have been basically demanding more of a say in regard to how the world is governed. And as China, India, Brazil, and others have got more powerful, they're putting more pressure on it. But that system of regimes also included a kind of set of nuclear agreements about nuclear weapons. And it seems to be, if you look right across the piece, that those regimes from 1945 and thereafter, they don't fit the big powers as much as well as they used to. And each one of them is kind of stretching its arms and legs and muscles to try to get out of those, because there is a kind of new, greater nationalist levels of rivalry, great power rivalry.
Okay, let's talk about the treaty in particular. Yep. Signed in 1987. It reduced massively the number of missiles that were available. But in abandoning it, the United States says Russia had been breaking the treaty for 8 years. And it's a question of sort of, do we believe them when they say their missile can only go 480 kilometers when it's banned if it goes over 500? But do you believe that America is perhaps being wrongly vilified for suggesting that Russia is to blame for the end of the treaty?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And the first indication from America that Russia was violating the INF came from the Obama administration. And there's agreement across the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And you see agreement across liberal and more hawkish arms control advocates that Russia was violating the INF.
Do you think it was?
Breach, yes.
Okay. Therefore, why could not more pressure be put on Russia to return to the terms of the agreement, rather than America eventually having to say effectively, look, you're not playing by the rules, why should we play by the same rules? Why could the world not do this to Russia?
So the Obama administration had lots and lots of meetings with Russia, and they just said, they presented quite detailed terms of the violation, and Russia said, no, we didn't.
This was the Novator 9M729.
Yes.
Was it ever put to them that if they invited in international inspectors to check on the capabilities of this missile, it could be proved one way or the other? This isn't the main point of the program, but I just find this fascinating.
Yeah, I think that the Obama administration left a lot for the next administration to do. They kicked the can down the road a little bit. They could have been a little bit more active. And then the Trump administration they could have gone a lot further, but it is Russia that was in material breach. And when Russia said, yeah, but you were doing it too, it was just a little bit of, well, you caught us, but we think it's your fault as well. What do we do?
Because of this treaty being abandoned, other non-proliferation treaties are in danger. And if that is the case, what are they? And where could that lead us, Grant?
Yes. So in this context of worsening relations between the United States and Russia and NATO and Russia, we have the New START Treaty. So that is the
Strategic Arms Reduction talk START.
That's the crown jewel of arms control. So the INF, it took away an entire class of weapons. It just eliminated them completely.
Short to medium range?
Yeah, short to medium range, ground-based launched missiles, nuclear and conventional. It just got rid of all of them. The New START Treaty was your long-range intercontinental missiles. It puts just an absolute limit on the numbers. So at the moment, we have basically 5 times less than we had at the middle or height of the Cold War in terms of absolute numbers of nuclear weapons being deployed. And the INF reduced by quite a lot, got rid of a whole class, but getting New START looks like it's in trouble. I think everyone needs to...
So the whole essence of the liberal international order having some kind of say in a nuclear arms race seems to be disappearing.
Yes.
Where does that leave Europe?
I am very worried about where this actually will leave Europe. Now, a short while ago, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron floated the idea, actually nothing new, they refloated the idea of a full-fledged European army. Now, could this ever happen? That would be a totally different debate. First of all, who would run the command structure in case something happens? But leaving this aside, it shows that the Europeans were already rather disgruntled, to put it diplomatically, being completely dependent on what either NATO or Washington is saying in defense matters. So there was this undercurrent, a stronger European voice. Now, this will only reinforce itself. And since the Munich conference is held in Germany, of course, I'm pretty much sure behind closed doors, in the lobbies, in the corridors, people will start to think about why was it not possible that we told Washington, or some would argue told Washington and Moscow, keep the INF treaty? Where was the European voice? No one wants to listen to us. Do we have any voice at all? So I think this could be one debate which will be reinforced. Secondly, a point which was not mentioned so far, but which I'm rather keen on exploring further. It's not only the defense system, the tactical, strategic dimension. I believe there is a huge economic dimension attached to it. American defense industry needs huge investments, which it didn't have over the past years, some say even decade. And President Trump says America first, and this is a wonderful possibility for him to have investment into this sector. But I think without the INF treaty, life in Europe will become more complicated. Why do I say this? There is the risk of a new Cold War. There is an arms race which might restart, literally where Europe used to be divided. I mentioned the Baltic states before. They are really worried. They are not worried that Russia is actually going to invade them. This is sometimes made in certain articles, but they are more worried about a general risk of confrontation involving the United States and involving
Are these
Russia.
Specifically the Baltic states that border Russia?
Yes, yes. In particular, the border with Russia. You heard this in NATO debates as well. Should NATO now reinforce its troops literally at the border? You may not hear this debate that much in Spain or Portugal, but this is exactly the point. Will Europe speak with one defense voice? Then, of course, you have viewpoints from Italy, Spain, Portugal, everywhere. What will happen to the United Kingdom after Brexit? And would this threat of a Cold War actually lead to a certain extra potion of doses of European integration?
Okay,
European integration in the
let me
defense
stop
matter.
you for a second.
Sure.
Please weigh in at any particular time. And I think, Grant, you're not certain that there is a new Cold War coming. Tell me in just a moment, but I want to ask about the possibility, if, as is suggested, there is an arms race, or the defense industry in the United States gets to kick on with this for whatever reasons, yeah? Then a lot more missiles and weapons are made. Could we return to a time where there is pressure for these to be deployed again in Europe, particularly in the area that Klaus is referring to, the Baltic states, or perhaps the old Soviet satellites, such as Poland?
Well, I think that is the key, that if you break the INF treaty, which is suspended at the moment and not totally abrogated, then you do open up the position that you could have Pershing
60 days
cruise missiles. I think 6 months.
6 months. I knew there was a 6 in it somewhere.
But you can locate those, what used to be called cruise missiles and Pershing missiles and SS-20s and so on. And I think that then raises the level of tension. I think the underlying theory of those weapons is that they are a kind of tactical or battlefield weapons. So if a conventional war between great powers was to kind of be in danger of being lost, you could go to tactical nuclear weapons, which they believe are low yield and about a third of the size of Hiroshima.
And let us see how the United States could get drawn into this, because of course it is several continents away. But let us say something happens in one of the fellow NATO member countries, it is obliged by the treaty, North Atlantic Treaty, to go to the defense of that country. So although you have Russia here and you have the United States here, if something happens in between, that's the flashpoint.
That's it. That's the key. And there is a new kind of grade of missile, nuclear weapon, which is being developed by the United States, which is much more lethal. But it is based on this idea that you can prevent an all-out nuclear exchange by doing this kind of battlefield level or tactical level. That raises the tension. not only in Europe actually, although Europe will probably be the kind of cockpit or the big battleground, but I think this is also aimed, as Klaus said, at the technological edge that the United States believes it's losing, particularly to China. And I think the kind of attempt to subordinate Chinese high-tech development, the Made in China program 2025 and so on, I think that is the kind of one of the key drivers of this kind of...
Help us with that. How does that fit into a weapons?
Well, the Chinese are not part of the INF Treaty.
Yeah.
In 1987, China was really, as a global military power or whatever, and economic power was very much smaller. But China today, with its high-tech companies, which are world-beating companies now, they are challenging the United States, and some of them are ahead in terms of new generation of technologies. And that, if you like, if the United States, the White House issued a report just a few months ago about its own supply chains and its vulnerabilities and where it was getting the minerals from to actually create these technologies. And they found out that a large number of them were in strategically vulnerable places or in what they would consider now to be rival states like China, like rare earths.
Rare earth minerals.
Yes.
But, Grant, you don't think, we're talking about almost an apocalyptic situation here, you don't think that that is necessarily going to happen?
Russia is not the USSR. Russia has a smaller economy than the United Kingdom. There's several countries in Western Europe that have larger economies than Russia. The reason they're a problem is nuclear weapons. So
are you suggesting that, because this was one of the reasons why the Cold War ended, because the Soviet Union collapsed, because it was involved in an arms race with the United States, it could no longer afford to spend the money that it was spending?
yeah,
Are you saying it's still in that same position, that it can't do it because it physically can't afford to do it?
the United States has and the Allies have all kinds of options when it comes to balancing the system that Russia cheated with. They don't need a like-for-like replacement. They can do it with sea or air-based missiles. What is the problem is European coordination and Europe speaking with one voice.
And Klaus, is that going to happen? Because it is, as I've read somewhere, Europe has to take care of itself, I think is mentioned in the Munich Security document. Is that fragmentation of Europe the real danger? And if it is, how can it be pulled together?
Well, I'll come to that in 1 second. If I only may add one more brief point. Not only what worries me is that the new weapons are actually being made if all of these treaties are shelved. Weapons which are made are unfortunately very often used. What would happen if not in Europe directly, but a third country location somewhere in the world where conflict is rife actually leads to a confrontation between Moscow and Washington? What would happen then? And I'm not only talking about the Middle East, I talk about the world in general. One of the underlying reasons I heard from Washington was that we have new security threats, including Asia and China. Hence, we need to have either enlarged the INF Treaty or we will abandon it. Now, that was exactly what they did. This is one of the worries I have. What would happen with the third country conflict?
Well, before you come back to answer my question, Grant,
okay.
Address that point.
The US left the INF Treaty for the same reason Russia left the INF Treaty. The people in charge felt it constrained power. They're not interested in arms control, and that makes them dangerous in my view.
But in a sense, you're agreeing with what Klaus is suggesting, that the focus is shifted to other perceived threats. Or am I reading that wrong?
I mean, there's basically the most important arena in the world is where this tiny circle in Asia, where half the world's population lives. That's where the middle of the 21st century geopolitics is going to be the most important. And that means China. And China is not party to the INF. Both Russia and the US have said that when they were talking about withdrawing. So this is part of the equation. We need to get a new INF treaty, though, a new replacement.
Klaus, come back to you in just a moment. If the whole of the world map of arms control has to be redrawn and include powerful countries such as China, India, even, nuclear power.
Pakistan.
Pakistan too, and we could add more to the list. If it has to be redrawn for the safety of the globe, not just Europe, is that at all possible?
It's difficult at the moment, but it's not impossible. The key issue is are there the political conditions for stability, which would then bring about some kind of dialogue? And I think the instabilities are far stronger than the grounds for stability at the moment. And we can see that in the volatility of politics all around the world. The established political parties, which I'm very much wedded to the way things used to be, whenever they give anybody else a chance to stand against them, those other forces tend to do very well or they win. And we have those kind of forces operating in Europe. We have them in the United States. We have them in other places as well.
So it is possible, but the
grounds
conditions
for that-
aren't necessarily there at the moment, and whatever way it is a long way off. And if we come back to Europe, Klaus, which is where we started this conversation, how does it get its act together to negate the threat that it perceives to be coming from the east in terms of the military capability of Russia, and from the ambivalence that it sees, the abandonment of its allies from the point of view of the US? How does Europe deal with that?
Well, it is a very complicated issue, even to comment upon. Now, if we add into the mix the rise of the far right and extremist political movements everywhere in Europe, and that European leaders have to address those issues by promoting alternatives, by defending democracy, my idea is that, or my impression is that, in order to stem the tide of anti-Europeanism, no Frexits, no Paxits, in order to stem the tide of far-right movements, I think European integration will top the agenda once more. What can they suggest? There is a single market, there is free movement, you have it, there is the euro. The only issue left is defense policies. The last pillar missing on this house, Europe, as it is called in integration science, the last pillar is missing a full-fledged common foreign and security policy.
Okay, and if there were one,
yes,
what would its underlying strength be?
I think it would not be a competitor to NATO, but I think it would make sure that Europe basically speaks with one voice within NATO. And if there is a problem like INF treaties or others being at the risk of being shelved, immediately verbally intervenes. And perhaps now would be the task to intervene and say, let's go back to the negotiating table and do INF 2.0. I don't say it will happen overnight.
Yeah.
It is extremely complicated, but I hope it will happen, if a commentator may say this.
Okay, and Grant, please say whatever is on your mind, but I mean, my question is, if what Klaus suggests happens and we get INF 2, we get the coming together of Europe as a collective in terms of defence, would that be enough to prevent somebody deciding somewhere that they're going to put their finger on the button, or has that always been a possibility and something we just have to live with?
We have to live with as a world that Donald Trump has complete sole authority to launch all America's nuclear weapons. That's an American domestic politics problem. I think every Democratic candidate will come forward with a proposal to limit presidential power on nuclear weapons. I think that's something we should expect.
And what do we do? Well, I say we collectively. I'm sorry, I should take myself out of this. But what does one do about the fact that President Putin on the other side seems relatively belligerent?
That's quite a good question. I think a lot of conversation about Putin is ascribing some devious intent that he perhaps doesn't possess. That everything is part of some grand coordinated plan, that he's far more capable and Russia is far more capable than it is. Maybe it makes mistakes like we do too. So like its bungled assassination attempt in
So we just have to hope, Klaus, that President Putin's sort of bluffing.
Well, Donald Trump is saying America first. Up to a certain extent, Vladimir Putin is saying Russia first. Now, these two leaders will be pretty busy, I hope, with their own domestic policies. I don't see Russia is now aiming at controlling the world, to be honest. Neither do I see that Donald Trump wants to actually engage in warfare all around the world. The only thing what those both leaders, with all modesty, overlook is if you produce arms, there is the risk of one day they have to be used. And as I've said before, what happens if you two guys then meet somewhere else in a conflict zone, closer to us or somewhere around the world? What would happen if you have to decide, are we going to actually, well, you can't attack. Are we going to have a serious confrontation between Washington and Moscow?
Inderjeet, final word from you. These are two big egos puffing out their chests. They don't really mean what they say, and it's going to be the status quo in many ways.
No, I think the status quo is a nice thing to think about, but I think there is no status quo. The world is being kind of remade, renegotiated, and I think what we've got to look at is the relative strength of the great powers. The United States spends close to $700 billion per annum on their military. Russia spends about $69 billion per annum. That's less than 10%, and the Chinese spend about 20%, but they're all in the upward direction.
Okay.
And I think that is what is increasing and driving the tensions.
Listen, thank you. So many other questions raised during the course of this program. One thing that you said, Klaus, said Russia is not interested in controlling the world, but it is increasing its spheres of influence, and that will be a future roundtable, one we've already got in the works in terms of planning. Thank you for watching. Thank you for taking part. We hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team here at TRT World. Goodbye for now.